The rope scratched at her throat. For a few inches the hemp rasped against warm skin, an intimate, terrible friction that made the world around her narrow to the soundless pressure beneath her jaw. The town had come to watch justice take shape like a machine, a scaffolding of wood, a heap of stones for witnesses to stand upon, a square full of faces that had practiced the expression of verdicts for years. The slave girl was to be hanged, but the priest did the unthinkable and changed her fate. 1842. 2 days earlier, the house at Serra Dourada breathed like a secret. It lay folded into the hills, whitewashed, shutters open to sun and to the thin, dry wind that smelled of dust and cattle. The main house sat on a small rise, a string of outbuildings and pens below it, and fields that stepped down toward a river that spoke at night when it had water. On the veranda, where afternoon light burned the wood to honey, Donna Dorotea would sit in slow ceremony, arranging herself as if each movement were praise. She loved adornments the way others loved prayer, with a ritual exactitude that required witnesses. Olivia knew every tilt of that ritual. She had spent years learning the mistress's moods through the way a cuff was smoothed and the angle at which a hand held a glass. She knew the sound of Dorotea's laugh and the small, brittle tremor that preceded a scold. She knew how to carry things so they did not jostle the woman's illusions. She had learned how to move like a shadow that made Dorothy's vanity look larger and safer by contrast. On the morning the necklace arrived, the house was unusually hushed. A man from the nearby town had come with a velvet-covered case, and he had bowed with the kind of reverence one reserves for relics or crowns. The emeralds lay within like green fires. A string of polished light settled upon black velvet. Dorotea's hands hovered above them, with the air of someone who touched glass when afraid of breaking it. She wore them as if she were wearing a sentence that said she belonged. The necklace altered how people saw her at every meal, at every sitting, at every church pew. Olivia handled the velvet box with the same care she handled bread before the table or the silver bowl on feast days. Her fingers were careful because she had to be careful. A servant's mistake could be read like a crime. She knelt to undo the clasp, breathed near the jewel so the mistress could see the green deepen in the light, and set the chain with precise motions across Dorotea's throat. The mistress's face, for that bright minute, softened into a small, private joy, and Olivia watched what it did to the room. She watched the way Senor Aníbal, returning from his rounds, lifted his chin as if the jewel's presence reinforced the strictness in his mouth. He liked appearances kept tidy. They were the scaffolding of his authority. The household ran by rituals no one outside the gate saw. Polished floors, a table laid with a certain angle of silver, servants moving through choreographed paths, so dangers, of gossip, of debt, of shame, might not spill into the open air. But beneath the veneer were currents that hummed like low thunder. Dorotea's vanity had always cost more than the household accounts admitted. Lately, it had been accompanied by furtive journeys to town at dusk, by tight lips when the ledgers were mentioned, by coin that vanished from the mistress's drawers. Credit had been found, and promises made to men who could smudge a reputation in exchange for money. One of those men, soft-voiced and careful with the tongue, was Joaquim, the jeweler-cum-pawnbroker, who kept his ledgers open as though they were prayers, and expected repayment in whatever jewel could be pried from a desperate hand. Padre Anselmo had watched such things for years, not as a policeman but as a weather eye for souls. He was small and plain and often smelled of tobacco and church wax. He wore his cassock like a garment that had been worn thin over time, mended where necessary and always clean in the front. He knew the names of everyone in the valley, not the way a magistrate might, but in the way a man maps his parish with the tenderness of someone who will follow the bodies to their graves. He treated Olivia with the same ordinary respect he gave to any child who came to him with a scraped knee. In a world that measured worth by pedigree and purse, his habit of bending to meet the eyes of servants felt scandalous to some and merciful to others. Olivia moved through the house as a quiet engine. Her hands were always in motion, polishing, folding, arranging small things so they did not announce their disorder. She kept her own life small and close, a mat beneath the back stairs, a scrap of bread wrapped in oilcloth, a few coins sewn into a hem. She allowed herself to imagine a table that was hers, simple and clean, only as a thought that could not be named aloud. The habit of always minimizing need made her less visible, made her easier to overlook, and that, in the view of some, made her the convenient receptacle for blame when misfortune needed a body. The morning the emeralds were found missing began like any other. A sky flayed hard with light, insects whining in the reeds. Dorothea found the clasp loose and frowned at the velvet box. The look on her face when she discovered the gap was not so much panic, panic was too honest, but a sharp calculation that tightened her mouth. It is an old human thing. When the world advances with a demand, the heart seeks a scapegoat. Dorothea first paced, then closed the shutters, and made the household stand still to be ordered and scoured by suspicion. Her palms were cold. Someone might read them as trembling. She accused the simplest target. Olivia had been the last to touch the case. She had set the stones upon Dorothea's throat, had smoothed the chain back into place. In the mind that feared exposure, that knew the mistress had been borrowing from men called Joachim and others, a single thread was enough to weave guilt. The mistress's voice, when it landed on Olivia, had the peculiar authority of terror. It needed to name a criminal, and it needed that criminal to be small enough to snuff out. Names can be weapons. Accusation is often a blade wielded by hands that shake. There was no formal trial, as one might imagine, in a stranger's law. Power in Serra Dourada was exercised like a household rule, the master's decision bleeding into the public square. Anibal favored examples. He believed reputation could be mended by severity. It was a lesson he had been taught by his father and reinforced by every whispered barroom story about men who let shame spread. He held meetings in the morning beyond the archives, and in his voice there was a calculation of show and deterrent. Olivia's punishment began with a searching that felt like a ceremony. Linen torn away, hands probing, soldiers, servants instructed by the overseer, turning her body with the practiced dispassion of people who had known to do such acts many times without seeing the soul beneath. She did not plead. She had learned, perhaps in the first years of her life, that pleading often invites cruelties that go beyond what is necessary. Her mouth closed around the commonness of prayer no one saw, and her jaw set as hands found nothing but the thinness of a woman, kept small. They cut her skin with lashes of rope and of stinging whip, but the description of that cruelty is not meant to be spectacle. The blows were a language of warning, not a rehearsal in savagery. Olivia bore them with the same economy she used to bear all things, patient, precise, like one who knows suffering as a domestic chore to be completed. Blood darkened her sleeve. The overseer's face was a stone face. The master's orders were publicly given. She would be made an example, and the line drawn between those who owned and those who served must not blur. Padre Anselmo heard the rumor like a bell tolling for the living. He found Olivia later that night, in a small room where a lantern threw a pool of light onto a cot. He sat for a long time holding her hand, no confession spoken, no sermon given, only the warmth of a human pulse resting between his fingers. He carried with him, like all priests, the knowledge of a law older than any man-made edict. A secret whispered in the dark is a trust that binds the keeper. The confessional had been used that very morning by Dorothea, who had come to the church in a satin dress and a face that tried to look untroubled. Her words inside the little shuttered box were not for the world. The priest heard what she entrusted to God, and the sacred silence that followed was not his to break. That silence became a living thing inside him. It pressed against his ribs the way a disease presses. He carried the fact of Dorothea's confession like a second skin. He could not speak it. He could not use it as evidence in a court or at a hearth. Yet he could not watch a body hanged for another's fear. The conflict was as old as conscience itself, obedience to sacred law versus the immediate imperative of saving a life. He paced the nave of the church at midnight, listening to wind through rafters, measuring the weight of each syllable that he could not utter. Dorothea had admitted to him in that darkened place that she was afraid. She had admitted to falsehood. She had confessed to hiding the necklace and then, in a panic, pointing at Olivia to cover her own cards. The priest had listened and had given the usual absolution, the prayers that seal a sin into grace, but absolution does not unmake consequences. He had placed a candle for her, as one might place a shield, and then had walked out beneath the stars with his cassock flapping like a modest flag. He thought of the seal as something more than a rule. It was a covenant. To break it would be to undo the one place people could go when every other door was barred. To betray confession would make his church a place of calculation. And yet the voice in his head that would not be quieted belonged to a woman who might die because of another woman's fear. At dawn he rode with a small satchel, a worn horse that had the patience of someone used to being asked to do heavy things. He went not to town but to places where a worried woman might have ridden in haste, tracks trodden down by cartwheels, the line of a fence that twisted away into a thicket, a stream where a rider might water the horse and try to hide what she had done. He did not speak of his purpose. His feet hit the trail like a man in makeshift penance. He was careful always, careful to be plausible if villagers should ask, careful to keep his movements as a parish priest might in search of a lost child or a stray beast. He could not say that he was searching for proof of innocence. He could not name the sin told in the dark. The countryside under the heat of noon was a strange theatre. Heat shimmered above the ground. Insects orbited like small contemptuous stars. The priest's cassock clung to his body. His face was set and narrow. All along the way he kept running the shape of his decision through his mind. If he found the jewel, how would he bring it to court without exposing the seal? If he brought it back secreted within his satchel, who would believe that Providence had laid the jewel at his feet? The priest did not flatter himself with the notion of miracles. He knew how rumor could shape a miracle. But he also believed Providence worked in human hands and choices, and he had taken a vow to serve lives before reputations. He found tracks where a horse had crossed a shallow creek. He found a broken twig where someone had turned their mount too sharply. The brush near a small rise looked like any other brush until his fingers brushed something with a slick, unexpected coolness. It was a scrap of velvet, a black square mottled with dirt. Beneath it the green flickered, an emerald catching sun and answering with a flash like a living thing. He drew back the fabric, and for a heartbeat looked at the chain coiled like a snake's graceful rest. The jewel was heavier than he had imagined. Its green was the green of river depths and of the small dangerous things that hide in plain sight. He pressed the velvet to his chest and felt his heart thud like a guilty thing. Time narrowed. In his mind the gallows rose, beams against sky, ropes shifting like final breaths. The priest understood, with the clarity of a man who has lived long enough to see simple truths keep their weight, that possession of the necklace could change the course of what was to happen in the square. But to present it would beg a question no one would let him answer, without betraying what he had heard in the confessional. He could imagine the mouths. How did the priest know? How had he found it? Signs point back inevitably to Dorothea's whispered admission, and the priest could not speak that. He wrapped the velvet around the jewel and slid it beneath his cassock, just above his heart. It warmed against him like a small sin. He rode away, fast, every minute clawing at him as if the air was stolen. Back in the village, the news ran worse than a rumor. It spread like a fever, because the spectacle of making an example had the contagious quality of theatre. People gathered as if drawn by a tune they could not ignore. The square filled with a crowd that had come, they said, because justice was their bread. Mothers with children, men with sun-hardened necks, women with shawls, the overseer with his rigid chest, all edged forward. The gallows stood like an instrument of geometry in the middle, an outline of punishment and language. Olivia stood beneath it in a white shift, her neck bare and the rope looped high. Her face was not frantic. It was the face of one who had long gathered sorrow into a private basket, and now carried it to the center of public life, where everyone's eyes would pick at the seams. Donna Dorothea arrived like someone stepping into a scene meant to keep the world orderly. Her dress was immaculate, her hat set just so, as though her own dignity were a commodity to be displayed. She watched Annibal in the way of wives who seek to confirm a husband's decision. Annibal's face was hard as the iron he favored. He held the scale of power unblinking. Public order mattered more to him than any private scruple. He spoke in a measured voice about examples and the contamination of disobedience, and the crowd murmured assent, like people willing to believe whatever keeps what is theirs unassailed. Padre Anselmo arrived later than some expected. When he came, his cassock hung dark against his shoulders. People noticed him the way one notices a familiar stain on a wall. There's a recognition, then a sense that something must hold in place. He pushed through the throng as one goes through press and gossip, and his presence caused small ripples. Some bowed, some looked away, some began prayers under their breath. He did not climb the scaffold, nor did he make a spectacle of himself. He stood to the side, as if the edge of the crowd were a place a priest occupies when he both wants to be seen and must not presume. Inside the priest's mind, the jewel weighed like a future that was not yet his to shape. He had found proof close enough to touch, and yet the law he held within forbade him to declare how he came by it. To speak would be to unmake a sacred trust. To remain silent would allow a life to be taken for a lie. There is a cruelty to some choices. The theorem of human ethics is often that every available option carves something away. Annibal read the sequence with the certainty of a man who believes the world is legible. He asked if any witnesses had seen the mistress without her jewels. People murmured. A few hands rose, tradesmen who had been in the house market, or who had seen Dorothea in the market as she flaunted her necklace. The overseer, who rarely lied, spat an assertion that even servants had observed the mistress playing cards late at night with Joachim and others. Rumours folded into the official family story like a dark thread. What was not named opened as a space of its own, and a chorus of voices began to suggest that the household had tolerated other deceptions. No one knew at that moment that the priest held the velvet case beneath his cassock. His fingers touched the warm fabric now and then, as if to confirm it was still there. He had not decided how to use it. He had not yet reckoned with the way his act might shred the trust that made confession a harbour. Even as he watched Olivia stand beneath the rope, he felt the seal like a law inscribed beneath his skin. Joachim's name surfaced in the murmurs like a stone thrown into a still pond, rings of suspicion widening. He was a man who had made his living arranging the values of things, assessing stones, and sometimes accepting jewels as pledges for money until the owner could redeem them. His shop smelled of brass and old tins, of polished wood, and the faint lemon citrus of cleaning oil. He kept accounts like a ledger of sins and favours. He had been seen with Dorothea. He had the sort of familiarity that could be mistaken for intimacy. That morning, a nervous man, Joachim had been circling like someone hoping not to be seen, and when he was pushed by a friend of his own into saying something, he said it in a voice that trembled. There were rumours of Dorothea's debts. There were small exchange-driven affairs made in card rooms late at night. The crowd's appetite for a moral tale sharpened. The mistress could be both victim and villain. Olivia stood with a dignity that imposed itself like simple furniture in a room. Honest, plain, necessary. She did not scream when the noose tightened. She did not clutch at her throat. Her eyes moved over the crowd and met those of a child who tugged at his mother's sleeve and did not understand why adults wanted such harsh lessons. Somewhere in her chest, she held the quiet conviction that truth is sometimes as simple as a stone, resistant, small, and cold. If the world would not recognize it, she would still hold it. Padre Anselmo's decision quickened. He had less time than he had expected. He thought of the confessional, of the small shutter through which a voice becomes sacrament, and he counted the hours like a man who had to steal a life back from mechanics of power. He rode again through the stretch of hill, where a woman in a dress might slow her horse to conceal a parcel. He followed the trail of dust and crisscrossed a small ravine. He listened for what the land might reveal, a catch in a branch, a shoe print, the loose bank where a horse might stop. There is a kind of prayer that is made of action. The priest's hands, roughened by years of opening sacraments and turning pages, moved in a way that would shame those who think prayer is only words. He pushed through thorns, and once a thorn left a red nick in his palm. He swallowed the taste of copper and kept going. He did not rush because speed would make his discovery less credible. He moved with a resolve that conformed to the expectations of providence. Natural, not miraculous, plausible. At the edge of a shallow copse, where the brush wore away into a small path that animals used, he found the velvet square again. The green flashed beneath his fingers like a small argument against the entire day's design. He crouched and drew it close, but even as his breath clouded in the cool shade, he felt the whole parish like an audience pressing, the gallows like a verdict already pronounced in the grain of wood. He pressed the jewel into a hidden pocket, feeling the little round weight there like an accusation. There were decisions to be made that no law could prescribe. If he produced the jewel openly, questions would come that only a confession could answer. If he brought it as if found, he would imply that Providence had revealed truth to him in a manner that might be at worst suspicious and at best miraculous. Both paths bore consequences. One would protect the confidentiality that made the confessional possible, the other would expose a woman who begged the priest's mercy. He chose, in the quiet of that green place, the path that would keep the confessional whole while trying to rescue a life. As he rode back, the shadows began to lengthen, and bells from the chapel up on the knoll floated across the fields, the slow, patient peals of afternoon. He rode faster now, not with the awkwardness of a man acting outside his duty, but with the resolve of someone who had taken a terrible and private responsibility. News moves through a town like a second wind. By the time the priest returned, the plaza was crowded and the air felt like the inside of a drum. There were voices that rose with a righteous edge, and among them the crack of men who believed in the rectitude of hard punishments. Aníbal paced as a captain might on the morning of a decisive battle, every step a strategy, every line of his face an argument. Dorotea sat in a chair near the front like a queen who must practice innocence now with the ease of one who has rehearsed emotive expressions. Olivia's hands were steady, even as her robe clung from sweat. She had been given the scantest privacy, a small cloth over her head to dampen the spectacle. People kept a distance as if contagion were possible in the look of arrest. She thought of her childhood only in splinters rather than a continuous film, a woman's laughter beside a hearth, the touch of a palm in kindness, a small bowl of rice. Memory is a room in which one keeps one's dignity. She kept hers like a lamp to be carried through the dark. Padre Anselmo dismounted quietly at the square's edge. The velvet case under his cassock felt like an appendix he had not yet learned to live with. He did not go to the scaffold first. He surveyed faces instead. The baker who had given bread for years, the widow who had come to Mass, the young men who worked in the fields and now cheered for order, as if order were their right. He breathed in the dust and the human heat and walked toward the place where words might save or condemn. He could not imagine the exact syllables to speak. He had promised silence in the confessional. He had also promised to shepherd life. He had been trained to weigh such things, to bend law under the stress of mercy when necessary. The rope bit at Olivia's neck like a question. He opened his mouth and stepped into a position that would require him to perform both prudence and courage. The case under his cassock lay warm, an unspoken thing against his breast, a green that seemed to pulse in time with his own blood. Time seemed to hold a breath, and the crowd leaned forward as if a gust were about to pass through them. The priest could feel the line between ordained secrets and public acts, like the seam he might split with a single deliberate movement. He had a jewel, and with it he had a possibility, a way to break a noose without betraying a whisper. But whether the town would accept a priest's having found evidence, and whether Aníbal would accept such an intervention, were questions cut from hard cloth. As the sun slid down and the first shadow of the scaffold stretched long and thin, Padre Anselmo moved to the center of things, unrolling the delicate, dangerous lie he would tell the world, an account that would stop a noose without naming the confessional, without destroying the only place a desperate heart could go. He had practiced no speech, and yet his tongue felt ready. He reached into the secret pocket and felt the velvet like a small apology. He stepped forward, and Olivia's eyes found his with the faintest look of recognition, not of the jewel but of the fact that someone had come. Around them, the square waited with that terrible patience of a place that has scheduled punishment and now must see it performed. The priest opened his mouth to speak. The words were not yet clear, and the crowd held its breath as if it were an organ duel between right and mercy. At the edge of the high sun, a small movement occurred among the crowd. A man who had watched the mistress at cards slid forward as if something had shifted inside him. The priest's hand closed on the velvet, and, for a moment, the green seemed to send a cold pulse through his bones. He had found proof, but what he would say to bring it into the light without shattering the seal of a confession was still a question whose answer might cost him his reputation, his peace, and perhaps more. The bells tolled once, a slow two-note knell, and the moment hung like a cup suspended from a ceiling. He was about to act in a way that would bend rules to save a life. He was about to do the unthinkable. He stepped forward as if the square itself had given him leave. The velvet weighed against his chest like a secret heartbeat. For a moment he let his eyes find Olivia's, and there was between them an exchange that had no words, a small mercy wrapped in the shape of a man who had chosen to move. "People of Serra Dourada," Father Anselmo said, voice steady though his hands betrayed a tremor as they reached under his cassock. "I have come upon something in the course of my day, something that must be shown, for the sake of truth." The phrase was simple, the kind of measured sentence a priest uses when setting a table for confession in front of a man who thinks his sin is private. But the crowd bent toward it, like a field of heads tracking a bird. Aníbal's jaw tightened into a line. He knew the ritual of authority, and he knew an anomaly when he smelled one. Dorothea watched with a face that was all calm. Beneath that calm, the old calculation that had steered her before made a hard, frightened little sound. Father Anselmo's fingers drew the velvet from beneath his cassock and unfolded it with the care of a man opening an old letter. The green flash of the emeralds caught light, turned, and threw back a small fury. For an instant, the plaza was two things at once, the scaffold and the jewel, and the contrast made the air between them strange, as if it contained two different eras of justice. The crowd reacted at the same small human tempo, a ripple, then a murmur, then a sound that resembled conversation, but was really the grinding of assumptions. "Where did you find it?" Aníbal demanded. His voice, trained to cut and command, pushed itself through the press like a blade. "Where did you find this, Father?" Anselmo did what he had decided in the cool of the copse. He told the truth in a manner that would not unravel the confessional. "Near the ford," he said, "on a hoof-path half hidden in the grass. I found it as I walked after hearing news that a poor life was at stake. I brought it here as soon as I could." The answer was short, plausible. People in a rural parish often found stray things, jewels washed down banks, collars lost by hunters. It was a kind of banal providence the village could stomach. But Aníbal's eyes did not stay satisfied. He had power enough to smell what was omitted as keenly as another man might smell rot. "Why did you keep it hidden?" he asked, his tone close to accusation. "Why did you not take it at once to my steward or put it in the hands of the court?" "It was to avoid spectacle," Anselmo replied. "And because there are rules a confessor knows to respect in secret matters, I came as quickly as I could." He did not say that he had ridden like a man on penance. A few in the crowd began to nod as if the priest's version made tidy sense. People loved neatness. Neat stories released their breath. But others, those who had watched the household and seen its woven half-truths, looked askance. Joachim, who had been lingering at the rear like a man with one foot already on a boat, stepped forward then, as if the small shove of conscience had finally pushed him. He had his hands grimy from polishing and the smell of metal about him. He carried in his palm a paper note, folded and creased as if it had been kept where secrets live. "Father," Joachim called out, "you say you found this near the ford, but I can tell you this. The necklace is the same I once saw a woman bring to my bench, here in town." His voice carried because there was something raw in it, a businessman's memory that did not yet know the price of confession. Aníbal swung on him as if the jeweler had trespassed. "Do you accuse my wife of theft?" he barked, and the question landed like a thrown thing. Joachim did not flinch. He unfolded the paper, which was a small, ordinary slip, an account note, scrawled in a hand that tried for secrecy and failed. He had kept it as men who measure risks keep their proofs. "Not of theft, Señor Aníbal," he said, "but of having brought jewels to be pawned and of owing people. She came to me once when she needed money. I advised her not to sell such a piece, for it is worth more than a small loan. She left without selling. Later I learned she had been seen with another man playing cards. It is not proof of the taking, but it is proof she had need." There were noises now that did not belong to mercy or to malice, but to those small human reckonings that make up a village's truth. A widow in the third row clucked, and a young man spat. Some turned toward Dorothea with the curiosity that kills. How do you watch a proud woman fall? Dorothea shrank fractionally, though she tried to keep her posture as carefully arranged as her dress. Her fingers gripped at a handkerchief she had wrapped in lace. She had come to church that morning, not because she sought God, but because she sought shelter. She had come to the confessional like every woman who has secrets she cannot share with a neighbor. She had spoken to Father Anselmo, and in the hush of that tiny, shuttered space, she had felt something loosen. Absolution had been given, and for a moment it had felt as if the world would conform to the wish of her heart. Confession breaks some things and leaves others bruised. Absolution does not replace consequences. She swallowed and found that she could not return the look that Joachim gave her, which was not accusatory, so much as wounded. He had put his livelihood at risk with the truth. Annibal's face reddened. He stepped closer, like a man whose armor has been nicked. "I will hear no more lies," Annibal declared. "This is a private matter. My house is dishonored." "You would have a woman die for honor?" Father Anselmo's voice, a ribbon of calm pulled tight, moved through the square. The question was not meant to humiliate. It was an appeal to whatever restraint men keep when they see the edge of themselves. For Annibal, honor was an institution. For the priest, life was an obligation that rose above reputation. There was a pause into which people's breath pooled. Some looked at Annibal with the eyes of people whose faces had been flattened by company ledgers and hard labor. Others looked at Olivia, who did not now look small, but looked like a human presence set against the bright, skeptical sun. The overseer, sitting near the front like a man who had been paid to appear stern, muttered something about law and example. He was the kind of man who obeyed the rules of order, as if their weight were the only moral force in the world. Annibal heard him and clenched. He was a man who needed to demonstrate to the valley his mastery of consequence. To let Olivia live would undercut his principle. But the necklace lay between them like a wedge. Father Anselmo turned the velvet to show the stones again, letting the green speak for itself. He did not say where he had gone or how he had come upon it. He merely held it up as if offering to the crowd an object of judgment rather than a testimony of shame. "Does this not change things?" someone cried from the back. The voice carried the simple logic that evidence rewrites verdicts. It did change things if the crowd would accept that a priest, walking the fields, had found a necklace. The moment was precarious because human minds wedge curiosity into stories by the same gears that make law: explanation, motive, consequence. If the explanation required the priest to reveal a confessional secret, the priest would not speak. If the explanation did not require it, the village had to accept a plainer providence. Annibal felt the shift like a blade at his throat. What would become of his control if his household's misdeeds were aired, if the mistress's debts were known? He had always convinced himself that severity preserved the land's equilibrium, but that logic had a crack in it now, and the crack let light in. "Where did my wife get into debt?" he demanded instead, angling at Joachim, who stood with the look of a man whose conscience had become more expensive than his coins. "Who loaned her what she owed?" Joachim swallowed. There was a confession that trembling men tell when pressed, and Joachim had reached his limit. "Some were small loans, senor," he said. "Small men, card players. But this house, there is talk of wages in the town. I am not a magistrate. I keep accounts for a living. I know coins are missing. I know the mistress has owed men like me favors." A ripple of recognition ran along the crowd, as if they had all been waiting for a permission to whisper. Women in their bonnets exchanged looks. Children were hustled closer by mothers, who did not want them to miss any more of a lesson than they already had. Dorothea's face trembled, an almost invisible crumple that looked worse in the spotlight of judgment. Annibal turned to his wife as if rotating a tool for examination. "Is this true?" he demanded. "Do you confess that you sought money by selling what is ours, or by swindling this household's honor?" Dorothea's lips opened and closed. She had nothing in her to say that would restore what had been. In the confessional she had spoken words that would not now leave the sealed room. Absolution had touched her like a balm, yet the balm could not clean the ledger. She looked at Father Anselmo, who lifted his head but did not meet her gaze with the specifics he had heard behind sealed doors. He could not betray the voice that had trusted him. He could not name the transaction she had described. He would not be the instrument that dissolved the one private refuge people had in the valley. "You will hear the facts," he said finally, "and you will judge with care. But let no one act with haste. Let this piece of evidence speak, and let those who have other evidence bring it forth." It was a compromise, an adjudication between duty and conscience. and it held because communities often prefer to believe the priest keeps truth measured. Still, an undertow was moving through the crowd, suspicion of the mistress, pity for the accused, unease at the ease with which a life had nearly been extinguished. That was when the overseer, hot with the rage of a man who had been bested by the unexpected, called out an old custom. "We will not let this hang unresolved," he shouted. "If your master demands order, we shall hold that the law of the house is the law of the land. We cannot make examples dissolve on the word of a priest who finds a stone." Annibal's hand slammed down on the rail of the scaffold, and for a heartbeat, the man who had given orders all his adult life felt very small. His authority had been a construct, stabilized by fear. Now it required something more durable than fear if it were to remain. He had to decide whether to burn what remained of his dignity, or to double down on the spectacle that would prove him right. In the end, the village chose an interim. Olivia would not be taken to the noose that hour. The priest's appearance and the jewel's presence demanded investigation. Annibal agreed to delay the sentence, whether out of a wish to appear reasonable or because the town's gaze had become too sharp for his comfort was not clear. The crowd muttered, some outwardly relieved and some inwardly disappointed that justice would wait. They led Olivia down, not to freedom but to a small holding cell behind the town hall, a room meant to keep someone in sight. She walked with a dignity that made some of the onlookers feel suddenly ashamed, and with such shame comes a certain softening which is often the first grain of change. She did not run. She had nothing to flee to beyond the small lamp of self that had always kept her company. That afternoon the square was a place where people came to make things public that had long been private. Men spoke in corners, women disclosed in whispers. The story fractured into many smaller stories, all of which told of debts and cards, and of Dorothea's vanity becoming a public commodity. Joachim sold parts of his stock to pay his fear of reprisal, then at night left town when threats arrived, letters slipped under a door, men's footsteps too near his shop. He was a man who had always known the cost of his trade. That day the cost became higher. He left without seeing where his testimony might lead. In private, Annibal confronted his wife. There is violence more corrosive than a whip. It is the violence of words. He spoke with a fury that belonged less to accusation than to the feeling of having been made absurd. She listened and tried to explain in the language of fear. Debts, men who had promised discretion, the night she had meant to pawn but had been frightened away. It was not redemption. It was small explanation. When you have placed your life inside a net of secrets, the net will always fray at the point where truth meets need. "You put us at risk for your vanity," Annibal said. "You have risked more than coins. You have risked the honor of my house." "I thought," she began, voice thin. "But thought is a poor shield when a man has decided what will defend him." He did not drag her to the town square. He could not bear to admit that the blow had come from within his own roof. Instead, he punished as men often punish those they once loved, by removing them from the scene where their trespass had become public. Dorothea was confined in a small suite in the back of the house. The servants were told to treat her with care, but to keep the curtains closed. She existed now as a thing to be hidden, an embarrassed jewel that once lit up rooms, but now threw stubborn shadows. Word of her confinement leaked like damp through plaster. Servants told neighbors in hushed tones, and gossip became a kind of currency. People sympathized with the scandal, but seldom enough to step toward Dorothea with anything that resembled charity. And because social life in these parts is mercilessly curious, the story traveled beyond the fields and the chapel into the surrounding hamlets. News twisted into rumor. Dorothea's debts were larger than anyone had imagined. Annibal's sternness was both praised and seen as brittle. Father Anselmo did his work after the square emptied. He returned to his small church, where the candles guttered like small hearts, and sat in a chair that had been pressed by ages of sorrow. He laid the velvet on the table before him, and touched it as if it were an unread letter. The stone's green caught in the lamplight and threw an answer he could not receive. He had preserved the seal of confession. He had not told what had been whispered in the dark. He had saved a life, and he had buried in himself the knowledge of who had spoken. That night he said extra prayers for Dorothea, for Annibal, for Joachim, and for Olivia. Prayer in such times is not an incantation, but a tether, A man reaches toward a thought and often finds the thought does not answer. He felt no triumph. He felt instead the peculiar loneliness of a man who had taken into himself a thing forbidden to be public. He had obeyed the code of his office and then bent it with a private act of mercy. The two rules sat like two islands in his chest, and he could not make them one. Days followed like a river's slow measure. Deputations came to speak with Hannibal, to whisper about the steward's methods, to suggest that the scandal had damaged all their business. Merchants who once sold to Hannibal's table began to reduce orders. The man who had prided himself on being above talk felt his world tilting like a poorly set loom. He found himself missing the ease with which commands had once moved men. Now the ledger of his reputation bore small red notes which were harder to erase than any ink. Olivia's fate shifted in ways that strangers did not expect. The villagers, who had been spectators to a tableau of power, grew uneasy at the idea that a life might be taken in their name. It is often true in small towns that the shock of potential injustice will spur an inconvenient conscience. A baker, who had long admired Olivia's quiet kindness, a widow who had been comforted by the priest in the night, and a man who once had received a loaf she had saved for him, met in a whisper and decided to raise a small sum. The word buy is ugly in the mouth of those not accustomed to such transactions, yet there are times when buying a human being's freedom is the only legal route a community knows. They collected coin in a hat that passed through hands, shamed by the knowledge of what had almost happened. The sum was neither grand nor small in itself, but it was enough. Father Anselmo touched the coins with the same tenderness he gave to the chalice. He took his part in the transaction as if to bless it with a liturgical gesture. A handshake, a small prayer, a whispered request that the freed woman might find a life away from the field where she had always been measured. Hannibal accepted the money in public because he wished to appear magnanimous. The gesture suited him as if a new uniform had been fitted. He signed the papers required by the notary, who wrote the words as if they were neutral, and forgot the human cost of such ink. Olivia was declared free, legally bought from the system that had owned her. But freedom, as anyone who has studied the tides knows, is a word that must be furnished with a place in which to stand. The villagers did what they could. They set her up with a small room above a baker's shop. She learned to fold linens in a way that paid her rent and bought the occasional new bowl. She kept a lamp by her bedside and placed it on a low table like a relic of the life she had been denied and now slowly reassembled. She did not return to the household. To be there would be to live daily with the face that had once accused her. The jewel, stripped of its role as weapon, passed into the steward's custody for a time, then into an appraisal, then into the bureaucratic muddle of inventory that seems to lessen even the worst of things by sheer paperwork. But the memory of that green, the way it had caught at the priest's conscience, would not be filed. It haunted the house like a portrait that could not be removed. Joachim's fate was of a different measure. Ostracized for his candor by some and praised by others, he chose flight as a safer course than staying. He took only what he could carry and left at dusk, because a man who has been threatened by a household's patron knows the difference between courage and mere stubbornness. He moved to a distant town, where his name did not carry the echo of having caused a mistress's ruin. There was no great tragedy in his leaving. He traded one life for another and hoped time would be kind. But kindness is in short supply for those who owe men money and have made enemies. He died several years later, in a place where the roads were not known to Hannibal or to Father Anselmo. His death was recorded in a small ledger, and no one at Serra Dourada wept as loudly as they had the day Olivia had been spared the noose. Dorothea's decline was quieter, but no less decisive. Confined, she watched the house she had once dazzled from become a place that spoke of restraint. Her face, once arrayed with the armor of beauty, faded into a sorrow that did not ask for forgiveness so much as for a return to a spineless normality she could not now claim. Hannibal, who had kept his house from ruin by an iron hand, now used that same hand to isolate the woman who had imperiled him. She died years later, removed to an outlying estate where illness and the damp of exile ate at her. Her death was small, without pomp. A woman who had been a jewel in some rooms, gone into another's earth without a choir. Hannibal, contrary to what he had feared, did not die immediately of shame or ridicule. He lived on to see a slow erosion of his social standing. Men denied him favors that once were given with a nod. Trade sites preferred other patrons. In the evenings he sat by a fire that did not warm as it once did, and he found himself looking more often across the fields at the places where men gathered without him. His insistence on severity had built him a house of brittle glass, and glass, he discovered, cuts in ways metal does not. Father Anselmo continued his parish with the strained serenity of a man who had performed a necessary but lonely miracle. People came to him for baptisms, for weddings, for counsel. They left him advice in coin and in praise. Many called him courageous. Others whispered that a priest had meddled where a man's duty lay. The truth was both simpler and more complex. He had kept a secret and thereby preserved a sanctuary. He had also bent a rule that he had sworn to keep. He carried that bending as one carries a stone in the pocket, constantly felt but never displayed. Years later, Olivia would visit the chapel of Serra Dourada not as a servant but as a free woman, who went to Mass because the chapel was where she had first learned to keep her grief in a pocket and to pray with hands folded. She found Father Anselmo older, his hair more snow than black, his hands less steady. They did not speak of the day at the gallows. There are acts people do that need no naming. She would sometimes place a small coin on the collection plate and watch him receive it, not because she owed him but because she wanted to be part of the fabric of the community, in a manner different from how she had been before. He saw her sometimes after services, and in the market where she sold folded linens and small loaves of sweet bread. He watched her from the doorway of the sacristy, and felt a small, private happiness that a life had been spared. He never unburdened himself of how the jewel had come to him. The seal remained intact in his bones. It was a secret kept not out of craft, but out of fidelity to a practice older than his own fears. The town itself learned a lesson that took years to crystallize. People began to see the household not as a single, monolithic thing, but as a collection of human hearts. The spectacle of judgment lost some of its taste. When a man stood to make an example, there were more hands ready to ask whether the example served justice or merely comforted someone else's fragile pride. That was not a revolution. It was merely the slow, patient accretion of small mercies. Olivia's life, freed from the domestic engine that had shaped her, became quiet and steady. She married in time to a man she had known from among the villagers, a cooper who had admired the precise economy with which she managed small things. They had a child who learned to walk in a house where love was not measured by ornament but by the daily provision of bread. She kept the memory of the rope as a thing that had once brushed her neck. She did not make it into a talisman. It was a thing to be remembered and allowed to pass into that private ledger of grief that every human keeps. She did not speak often of that day. When she did, it was in the low language of someone who had survived, rather than in rhetoric. Time, that slow erasing thing, did not make Father Anselmo's burden lighter. There were nights when he dreamed of the confessional shutter and of Dorothea's face turned away. He often walked to the ford where he had found the jewel, touched the flattened grass, and thought how an almost accident of location had spared a life. Providence, in his view, was not a lightning bolt, but a series of human choices. It makes itself manifest when people risk something for another. He had risked his reputation and his peace to save a life. That trade was not a triumph so much as a ledger entry with a heavy weight on one side. He grew older in the parish, and men began to look to him as a man both wise and strangely set apart. There were those who thought him brave, those who thought him foolish, and those who simply accepted him as a priest who had done what he thought right. Children who had been small the day Olivia was spared learned to say his name with the ease other children learned to say the name of the man who keeps the bell. He kept the jewel wrapped in a piece of dark cloth in a drawer, where he would sometimes open it and let the green catch the candlelight. It was not a thing he sought solace from. It was a reminder of where mercy had demanded an inconvenient human act. The years wore at the edges of Serra Dourada. The house lost its ostentation, the mistress's rooms gathered dust, the owner grew taciturn and older. The memory of that day at the gallows remained like a scar that sometimes stung after rain. People came, people left, and the fields continued their patient labor. When asked in later years which single act had shifted the town's arc, villagers would point to various things: the scandal, Joachim's testimony, the sale that freed Olivia, but most who had thought deeply about it would say the real change had been quieter. A priest chose to act, not by revealing every truth he had heard, but by doing what he could with the truth he had found. There were debates among scholars of the parish, if one may call them such, about whether his action was a formal violation or a higher obedience. Those who had lived through it spoke less in the abstract. They spoke about the smell of the square that day, the way the green of the jewels had flashed in the sun like a question, the look on Olivia's face as a man stepped toward her in public and offered a small proof that she need not die. For Father Anselmo, the moral was not easy or comfortable. He had not changed the law, nor absolved anyone of social consequence. He had preserved something essential, that a sacrament remained a sanctuary where the desperate could speak without fear of betrayal. He had also acted in a way that knowingly bent a rule a few degrees out of reverence for life. He paid for that with a private restlessness that sometimes rose in him like seasickness. Mercy had taken a tax from him in the form of sleepless nights, the feeling in his chest of having carried something too heavy. Olivia's later years were not heroic in the grand sense. They were small, patient, and human. She became a woman who learned new trades, collected a small store of friends, and would sometimes walk to the chapel to light a small candle. She lived to see her child grow and marry. She died years hence with a measure of peace that had not been hers, in the days when the rope had scratched at her throat. When people spoke of her in the market, they did so with a respect that felt near to reverence. She had become, in the town's memory, a symbol of something stubborn and tender, that dignity in the poor can outlast the vanity of the rich. As for Joachim, the man who had tipped the world, his fate was a lesson in risk and consequence. He had spoken truth in a place where truth often deserts the weak. He left town with the small dignity that belongs to those who do right, even when it costs them their place. He did not die celebrated, but the record of his testimony changed several lives. The ledger he left behind, papers, notes, little entries, would one day be sifted by another jeweler who found in its margins the trajectory of human error and human courage. And Anibal, living on the far side of his pride, grew older into a man who had once been the voice of fear. In the end, his house became quieter, his name less mentioned at fairs. He kept his order, but found himself thinking often of how fragile the scaffolding of reputation can prove. Pride, when stripped of its ornaments, shows what it has been made of. For him, the lesson was as bitter as any wine. Authority unaccompanied by justice produces its own kind of ruin. Years later, there were small private reckonings. A woman who had once tended fires on Dorothea's hearth came forward with a story that included a pawned ribbon. A young man who had been present at cards produced a recollection that made clearer the mistress's need. These were not dramatic revelations. They were the kind of small facts that eventually shape a more honest picture. They did not resurrect the dead, nor restore the years taken, but they did shift the balance of memory a little. The priest kept his secret until his hair was silver and his steps were measured. He knew that what he had done would be debated in the quiet corners of the valley. He did not expect absolution from the world. He had made his choice and lived with it. Once, in a late autumn, Olivia visited him not as supplicant but as neighbor. She brought bread and a word of thanks, short and simple, as if they both understood that gratitude need not be great to be true. He accepted it and felt his chest unclench a degree. Words sometimes do little. Sometimes they make the wound less raw. On the anniversary of that day, Father Anselmo would walk down to the ford to see if anything remained of the velvet in the grass. The place had changed. The water ran a little differently with the seasons. He would touch the bank and remember the tiny shock of green. He had no illusions about miracles. He trusted a different, more human providence, that one person sometimes acts for another, and in doing so shifts what might have been only a single body's fate into a wider pattern of small human mercy. The story of Serra Dourada was told and retold in different tones. Some told it as a parable of virtue. A priest saved a life by bending the rules. Others told it as a cautionary tale. A secret kept in the confessional can twist men into uneasy places. Most simply told it as what it had been, a complicated human event where duty, fear, compassion, vanity, and conscience intersected. It was, in the end, an ordinary miracle. A word used not to imply divine intervention, but to describe the astonishing fact that humans sometimes choose another's life over their own comfort, with the cost that choice entails. When people asked Father Anselmo whether he regretted his act, he would answer in the way of a man who knows that moral life is not split into neat headings. "I have done what I thought necessary to save a life," he would say. "Whether it was right in every sense is for God to judge. For me, it was a matter of mercy." And when asked whether the confessional had been compromised, he would smile with the flatness of someone who has carried a truth and is weary of arguing. "The confessional is a sanctuary," he'd say. "It must remain so. But God gives us the cunning of the heart to find ways within our vows to save life. That is the mystery we who are charged with souls must live with." The square where the gallows had stood did not forget the moment the folk of Serra Dourada rarely spoke of with the swagger of victors. They spoke of it with the soft voice of those who remember a time they might have been complicit. The scaffold itself was dismantled. Wood was turned into planks for houses and for furniture. Ironic, perhaps, that the very thing meant to make an example was used to build living rooms where children played. Perhaps that was the right end for it, to be taken down and made into utility rather than spectacle. As a storyteller, I cannot claim to know the final truth of hearts. I can say this much: a rope scratched a woman's throat. Though the rope was almost the instrument of finality, a man bound by a sacred promise chose to act in a way that saved her. He did not flaunt the means. He kept the confessional sealed. He found what he needed in the world outside the hushed box and presented it in a way the village could accept. The cost to him was not public punishment, but private peace. The cost to others was complicated and lasting. If this narrative moves you, if the question at its core, what would you do when law and life pull in opposite directions, stays with you, consider subscribing for more stories from history's quiet corners, where ordinary people meet extraordinary choices. In the end, the jewel went from a symbol of vanity to a proof that truth, when found, can sometimes be used to unmake injustice without shattering the sacred places people rely upon. The slave girl, Olivia, lived. She married, raised a child, and kept a small lamp by her bedside. Her life never became a tale of grandeur. It became instead a testament to the endurance of those whom history so often forgets. The priest continued his ministry, his name remembered with both gratitude and the whisper of something unresolved. Dorothea's life narrowed and then closed away from the world she had once displayed like an altar. Anibal watched the slow erosion of a power he had believed absolute. Joachim paid the cost of speaking. History, as the valley taught, is less the polished account of public deeds than the ledger of private choices. We remember the day because a man chose to do what the world might have named unthinkable. He changed a fate by bending his own rules for the sake of another. It is a messy, human kind of heroism, one that asks more questions than it offers answers. Tell me in the comments which decision struck you most: the priest's, Dorothea's, Anibal's, Joachim's, or Olivia's. Which human choice in this story feels the most familiar to you? Share the video with someone who values stories of conscience and mercy, and subscribe to hear the next tale from history's quiet edges.